Greetings, race community. Brent coming in live with today's guest, Christine Pena, who serves as Chief Advancement Officer of Miss Porter's School. Welcome, Christine.
Well, thanks so much. I'm happy to be here today with you, Brent.
All right. I have to start by just saying you are like ever true royalty. You are famous in ever true lore because we met a long time ago, early on, somewhere at a case conference, and we had all kinds of connections. St. Paul's, we'll talk more about it. But I have this stick that I've done at conferences just to get the room warmed up, where I ask people to pretend like they're on a roller coaster. And what do you do at the top of a roller coaster? You raise your arms up and you scream, okay? And I've done this a lot. And the way that I conduct this presentation now involves you 100% of the time. And I don't know if you fully appreciate how, but the way it usually goes is I say that everything I just said, and I take a picture of people as they are on the roller coaster. And then I say, when I get back to my office, I'm going to be reviewing this picture to see if any of you can overtake Christine Pena as the most emotional roller coaster rider in the history of my setup. And it looks something like that, Christine. I don't know if you remember this. I believe it was Case District 1. And it has just become one of those like parts of my entrepreneurial journey that I will like never, ever forget. Thank you.
What an honor. What an honor to see like terror on my face.
What I tell people is I don't know what's going on, but Christine needed a roller coaster ride that day. And
I did. Listen, that simulation prepared me well for career and advancement, Brent.
I love it. Well, let's talk about that career. And the way that I love to start the conversations is just learning a little bit more about your own academic journey, as that usually plants the seeds one way or another for the shift into advancement, which none of us knew was a thing in middle school, for example.
Right.
So take me back to high school, St. Paul's School in New Hampshire. Who was that Christine? What was she into? And what led you to Wesleyan University?
Oh, I love this question. So, I am old enough to remember a sitcom called Facts of Life. And it was about girls in a girls' boarding school and their experiences, what it was like to be living together in community. And there was something about that was incredibly appealing to me. And I remember turning at the dinner table one night to my mom and dad and saying, like, I think I really want to go to boarding school. And, the meal sort of continued, and you could tell that they were sort of looking at each other like, what is this? This is what we don't know anything about this. And, I
Can I ask, where was the dinner table?
Yeah, so it was at our home. I grew up in a small little town called West Falmouth, which is on Cape Cod. I'm a third generation native Cape Codder. And I was going to a very small independent day school there called Falmouth Academy. I want to shout them out because they're doing incredible work in that wonderful community. And it was really there sort of that I had learned to read and write and had a great appreciation for learning. My parents, non-college educated, working class folks, but who believed in sort of doing the best that they could for the next generation. So when I kind of dropped that bomb at the dinner table again, they didn't really overtly react. And I think that that's one of the gifts that they've always given to me when something is a little bit of a surprise, like just take it in and breathe and think a little bit about it. So I don't know, that was probably midweek. On Saturday morning, my mom said, hey, we're going to go to the library and learn about this boarding school thing. So at that point in time, there was no internet. You went to the library to gather information, and there was a giant red book. And we sat down and went through the book, and I chose a few schools, and my mom chose a few schools. She'd consulted with my dad, and one of the schools that my mom chose was St. Paul's School. And she chose it because it was an Episcopal school, and we're cradle to grave Episcopalians. I was like, there is no way I'm going there, because I had this, adolescent view of it being a place where it was overtly religiously strict. And that was not really what I wanted. Fast forward, we get to the campus visit because it was a non-negotiable that we were going to visit there. I get out of the car on a beautifully snowy day, and I just look at my parents and I say, this is where I want to be. So we know so often with the students that we support through philanthropy that their campus visit can make a big difference and that there can be a visceral reaction to a place. And that's really where my love affair of schools and the places where I've been began. I think every place I've ever been, I've tried to recreate that gut feeling again, about whether or not it's the right place for me. So I began my journey at St. Paul's in the 10th grade, and I have my best friends from there ever. And in some ways, I think my experience there also just as a kid who was heavily aided, lots of financial aid made that possible for me. I've always been incredibly grateful for that, but it also just opened up a whole new world for me and for my family, quite frankly, who were enormously supportive.
And so I will say, as a fellow first gen college student, where I sort of stumbled into the idea of starting Evertrue by way of some of my volunteer experience. One of my early co-founder, Jesse Bardo, had grown up on Andover's campus, and
Yeah.
he described himself as a fac brat. I had no idea what fac brat meant, for example, and it was sort of, and I really didn't know what Andover was or St. Paul's. I just, it wasn't a part of my world growing up in the Midwest, and so our early years of Evertrue were really focused on the independent and K-12 world, which is such a beautiful testing ground and so many life-changing stories like yours, where the challenges are essentially identical to those of higher ed as it relates to building and engaging a community and identifying relationships and going and doing the development work. It's just smaller, and you can kind of get everybody around a table without all of the complexities of higher ed. But I'll say it was like very eye-opening for me to get a window into that world. And so I'm just curious, like, it sounds like an amazing experience for you, but it also had to be just a huge change from third generation, Cape Cod.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think this is one of the ways in which we think about the power of education, and its impact and opportunity to change lives. But we also have to remember that when people come to our institutions, they've been living a life, they've been creating an identity, and their time in our places is just an opportunity to continue to shape that identity. Here I was, a first generation kid from working class family, African American woman, lived in a very small place. I mean, you had to cross the bridge to get to the rest of the world, which my parents always made sure that we did. We were always crossing the bridge to go someplace to learn something. And in a lot of ways, that was a metaphor for the way that they really chose to raise me and think about my education. Um, it was hard. It was hard to be a bit of a fish out of water. And, I think when you're a teenager, the things that you pay attention to are often focused on sort of wealth and privilege and expectation. And all of those things were in, full effect where I was. But as I grew and matured, it also gave me the opportunity to realize that the people I met thought in many different kinds of ways. They moved beyond stereotypes and expectations. And I'd like to think that they felt the same way about me, too. And, again, that living experience, getting to know people during my formative adolescence, really, again, opened my eyes to the ways in which people move through the world. And, a really stark reminder, you cannot judge a book by its cover. I don't even know if people say that anymore, but that was very much a part of the lesson
Well, I
that
feel
I
like
took from my
when I got
experience
to
there.
when I got to college without the boarding experience, I remember meeting kids who had gone to St. Paul's or Deerfield or some of these schools, and they seemed 5 years older than me, so much more mature, so much better prepared. I felt like I was this like young kid and they were like adults. And
Yeah.
it took me a little bit, I think, for that all to click, and maybe even doing like the early work at Evertrue was like, wow, like it really is a transformational experience. And
Yeah.
so did you feel that when you moved to Wesleyan, did you feel prepared in a way that, I don't know, maybe sort of the opposite of how I felt?
Yeah. No, I mean, here's the thing. Wesleyan was not a walk in the park. Because again, it was an incredible intellectual experience for me at Wesleyan. But, the sort of everyday stuff was easy for me. And, the joke in my family is that I was born a 40-year-old. So I think I already had a little bit of that maturity, but and wasn't really afraid to advocate for myself. So, that got sharpened at boarding school, and then I really put that to work when I went to Wesleyan. And I got to Wesleyan, I have to say, because I had an incredible mentor at St. Paul's who really felt that Wesleyan would be
Who
the
was
right
that?
fit for me.
Who was that?
His name is Brian Regan, and he himself was a Wesleyan alumnus and had been our choir teacher at St. Paul's, and had again been a very quiet champion for me. And somebody I had really learned a lot from. I loved to sing when I was in high school, and I think getting to Wesleyan, which was not a place that I knew very much about, hadn't really been on my college list. But when I got there, discovered that it was, again, another place that really challenged me to grow. So even though I did have sort of some of that maturity about being a freshman in college and the kinds, like I could do my own laundry, I knew how to ask for help. Those things are easy. Um, but, I felt very well equipped to do the academic work and to really be open. I'm a huge, huge believer in liberal education, because I think no matter what you specialize in the future, being informed from multiple, by multiple perspectives and experiences just makes you better at whatever it is that you choose to do professionally.
And you still feel
And
that way in this era
yeah,
of,
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. And this is an interesting moment in time of my life because I have a college sophomore about to be junior, and I believe in human potential. That's a big part of the reason why I continue to work in philanthropy. And, I think we need big thinkers. And I think liberal education affords people the opportunity to ask big questions, to wrestle with ideas, to be able to articulate those things. We need people who specialize in work as well. But I do think that when we're trying to solve problems, which, let's face it, a lot of work that people do is about solving problems. When you can think about or see other examples from other areas, I think you get a little bit better at it. So, you know,
when did a career in education and higher education enter the equation for you? Because you pretty much dove in, not immediately after college, but my understanding is almost immediately. And so maybe you sort of dove out and dove back in. Just tell me about that
yeah.
experience.
So it was senior year of college, and like everybody else, you're beginning to look for a job. And honestly, because of the amount of student loan debt that I had taken, the amount that my parents had invested in my education, which was a huge sacrifice for them, I needed to make a lot of money. And I needed to do that because I needed to help my sister have a similar kind of college experience, that we knew that that was the family obligation. And that's a story that a lot of families experience. You put a lot of into one, and then the one helps the one behind, or the
Yeah.
ones behind. So I took a job that I had no business taking in New York City, and I worked as a management consultant. And I made a boatload of money. Like, it solved a problem for me. I had no interest whatsoever really in the work. And I learned pretty quickly that I was sort of bad at it. So I'll never forget one day, lying on my bed in my overpriced studio apartment in New York, thinking like, I cannot do this for the rest of my life. This isn't going to cut it. Um, and I made a mental checklist in my head. What were the kinds of things that I most wanted to do with my working life? I wanted to work for people who I respected. I wanted to do work that was meaningful. And I wanted to have a job where I didn't have to wear pantyhose every day, right? I mean, and this is sort of the early 90s. It's the early 90s, right? So I began to make a plan again. How long am I going to be here? How long am I going to do this? It's going to be a means to an end. What have I learned? What have I learned? What do I want to take with me? So again, in that audit, I had really loved doing the volunteer work in what I then began to realize was sort of like the development office in the places where I'd been. I'd been a tour guide, I'd done some phonathon work, I'd met with people, again, taking stock of that. And so I got into admissions,
But
and
how did
that's
you
what
like,
started.
how did you decide, okay, you do the checklist, which by the way, everybody listening, you should all have your version of that checklist right
Yeah,
now. Okay. Like think about it right now. We should all come back to that framework on a somewhat regular basis. And
all the
so
time.
do that, right? Let's do that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's one thing to have that audit. It's another thing to decide you're going to apply to Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. So how did you then decide where to cast the net, why Dartmouth, and what stood out from that experience, which I'm excited to talk about because I feel like so many people in advancement just come up from advancement, right? Student caller, this, that, the other thing. Now I'm a VP of
Yeah.
advancement. 1 out of 20 pivot to admissions and then find their way back in. So I love learning from those experiences.
Yeah. Well, I think like we tell all of our students, I use my network. And that's how I ended up at Dartmouth. I had been working at Wesleyan. Again, to pay my way through college, I lived with, as a sort of a after-school helper, which came with free rent, free laundry, and free food with Barbara Jan Wilson, who at that point was the Dean of Admissions at Wesleyan,
Amazing.
right?
Wow.
Yep. So, and she was a
Oh,
great mentor in all kinds of ways, just not only in terms of what does it mean to work, but also to be a working mother with a pretty high-powered career. So when I knew that I wanted to leave my management consulting role in New York, I called her and we chatted for a little bit. And she said to me, you ought to talk to Carl Furstenberg, who was the dean of admission at Dartmouth. He had been the dean of admission at Wesleyan. And Barbara Jan sort of took on the role after Carl departed. So I had a great conversation with Carl, and he said, we're going to have a position open. I think you ought to apply. And I did, and went and had an interview and got the job, which was fantastic. And I think a lot of admissions is about decision making and relationship building, whether it's with the students you're trying to recruit, whether it's with the school counselors you're trying to work with. It's about explaining the importance of an education, and what the future opportunities can exist for young people. Very similar to the kind of work that I do right now in advancement.
amazing.
So,
I just have to say, Barbara Jan Wilson, when I think about all of the people that I've ever heard speak in this industry, one of the more high impact, I'd say almost provocative takes on philanthropy that I'd ever heard. And I just found it to be like both wildly pragmatic and extremely provocative at the same time.
yeah, that's what I love about her.
I
And,
wonder,
and she's a,
and for those who, most people maybe haven't
yeah,
or haven't crossed paths, you don't see a lot of people where on their LinkedIn profile it says Wesleyan University, 42 years and 8 months.
yeah.
Is talk about commitment. I wonder if I could get Jan on the podcast at some point.
Oh, let's do that.
Let's
Let's
do
do
it.
that. I think she really is a remarkable advancement leader. And, I've learned an enormous amount from her during my own career, not only in terms of our friendship, but as I said, she's been an incredible role model for me and a mentor in every way. And one of the things I think that's a hallmark for her is that she's launched so many people into their own advancement shops. I mean, if you put together a map of all of the folks who she has helped train and encourage and challenge, I mean, I think that's one of the greatest gifts that she gives. You said
Well,
she's provocative,
give me some
and
of
she
those
is.
names. Give me some of those names.
Oh,
We love a map
oh
at
my
Evertrue.
gosh. So Andy McGadney, who's now the president at Knox College, um, uh, Anne, Anne Bergen, who went back and
Yeah,
forth between universities, and now she's at um, Choate. Let's see, Greg Waldron at Providence
yeah, yeah.
College, right? It's a
So
pretty long
many.
list.
I love
Yeah,
it. I love it. So tell
to
me about
scratch the
life
surface.
as a development officer, or sorry, as an admissions officer. My understanding that can be a real road warrior. I mean, people talk about road warrior and advancement, but when you're in sort of peak admission season, here's the thing I love about admissions is every year, the clock runs out, the score goes back to zero, and it's like we don't have the 7, 8, 9 year capital campaign to sort of put things together. It's like we start from scratch again. And so the pace, and I feel like it's been a catalyst for maybe more innovation, or innovation and more naturally fit in enrollment, just because there's that kind of pressure, frankly. But tell me about your experience. Was it Road Warrior, more marketing? I mean, how'd it go?
Yeah, it was a little bit of everything. I did an awful lot of travel, and honestly, it was a great way to learn about the United States of America, to the ways in which cultural experiences impacted the life of young people. I spent a lot of time in different parts of California, and there's nothing like Friday Night Lights. What does it mean to go to a giant football game where the whole community comes out? What does it mean for kids not to be in school in certain times of the year because there's a harvest to bring in? What does it mean for kids to think about living in a state which is ginormous, and to go all the way across the country to do something different? I did a lot in the West, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, in addition to California, and so really being able to get a sense of what life is like, very different from life in small New England.
Well, and I feel like it probably helped form a great sense of empathy, which is something that I feel, having grown up in a really rural environment in Iowa, and going to Brown and doing my MBA at Harvard. It's sort of it has just given me such an opportunity to, especially in like how polarized everything is right now, where I at least feel like I kind of understand it. And I think
Yeah,
sometimes we're like, I truly don't understand how somebody could feel X, Y, and Z. It's like, well,
yeah.
I might not agree, but I actually completely understand why that's the case. And I find that, I don't know, calming in a period of, complexity.
Yeah, I think that's right, Brent. I mean, I think you got to try to understand where people are coming from and what influences their way of thinking and their understanding of the world, and that there's value in that, even if you don't agree. Even if you don't agree. Like you said, I might not I might not agree with it, but I have an understanding of why that person may feel or think that particular kind of way. And often it allows you to lean in with a little more curiosity. And, sometimes again, your mind might not be changed, but you should learn a little bit more when you lean in with that kind of curiosity. You should have a better sense of what informs people's thinking or experience. And I certainly doing the travel at that point in my career was
Yeah.
hugely helpful to developing that sense of openness. And it stood me well, particularly now that our advancement work has become more global in nature. When you're going into different parts of the world and really trying to get a glimpse of what it is that's important to people and how to match that with some cultural understanding about their sense of philanthropy and expectation around how they want to be giving and for the reasons that they want to be giving.
When did you decide to pursue your master's at Harvard?
Yeah. So I had a great time in my job at Dartmouth. And in fact, um, I applied to Harvard several times, got in and turned it down because I continued to have fun at Dartmouth in the work that I was doing. And finally, the dean of admissions had a conversation with him, was like, look, are you coming or not? This is your last chance. And I thought, well, I better take it. So I did. And I had been thinking a lot about whether or not I wanted to pursue a degree, a master's degree in education, or whether I wanted to pursue an MBA. And mostly because, again, in my time in admissions, I had some real philosophical desire to support the work there, but also because pragmatically, admissions is a revenue center for institutions, right? And so understanding its impact and relationship to the business of the organization was interesting to me.
Yeah,
Um,
that's something that I definitely didn't appreciate when I got into this industry, when I started the business around advancement, where it's like, oh, this is like one of the big revenue centers. And it's like, it is, but it is generally a distant second
yeah,
to tuition for the majority of institutions, save but
yeah,
the sort of really, small number that raise the kind of money that, that you're talking about.
Right, right. So, I think ultimately I chose to go to the ed school at Harvard because there were interesting professors there who I wanted to work with. Dick Chait, who's a focus on governance, was one of them, because I was really interested in how institutions functioned, how decisions were made. And Judy McLaughlin, who also was focused on the history of higher education, was also there. So those were things that had drawn me to the program. And finally, when I look back on that, I'm like, how did I tell Harvard no several times? I did, and it can be done. And the timing wasn't right for me. So again, another one of those things on my checklist. Is the timing right to be making the move, and how will that work? So when I said yes, I started in the fall and showed up and loved every single minute of it. It was really it was an
Why?
intellectual playground for me. Well, first of all, you're surrounded by super interesting people, and I had loved that about Wesleyan, and I had loved that about St. Paul's, but I was also a grown up, and I was also footing the bill myself. And I really felt like, gee, I better squeeze as much out of this as I possibly can. And it was also a moment where, as a grown up who wasn't really responsible to an employer, I broke rules. So like I didn't go to class because there was an interesting lecture that was happening, over at the Kennedy School. And the freedom to kind of do those kinds of things and think about education expansively was wonderful for me. Um, and I, also took on a lot of debt, which I do not regret. And, was grateful for the full experience. I really, again, you're more mature. You're more mature. You take advantage of it in a different kind of way than when you're a young person. So, it was great. And that, I knew going into the program, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was administration, policy, and planning, in higher ed. And so I was super interested in how institutions accomplish the things that were important to them. And, it came back to the old movie line, follow the money. And so that led me to having a job in the development office at the School of Education, where I worked with incredible
So
people like,
not quite Barbara Jan's house, but
no,
close second in year-round advancement, and that's sort of the side hustle.
that's right. That's exactly right.
And then
So,
you squarely pivoted into the major gift advancement path after that. Tell me about making that transition, and you must just have some really, I mean, I love hearing just like the most memorable visits, trips, experiences, like those donors that truly stand out the way that Barbara Jan Wilson stands out to me.
yeah. So I finished at the ed school, um, and I needed a job. And so I poked around. I thought I would go right back into admissions. At that point, I was seriously seeing the man who has been my husband for the last 20 some odd years. He had taken a job in Baltimore. And so we moved together there. And I was looking for admissions jobs like in DC. And they didn't quite feel right. And I came across a posting, I don't even know where, that the Madeira School in McLean, Virginia was looking for a major gift officer. And I thought to myself, well, I don't really have any experience doing this, but this seems interesting. I'm just going to throw my hat in the ring. And I'm glad I did because I ended up getting the role. And I was the first major gift officer that they had. And Betsy Griffith was the head of school at that point in time. And a woman named Kate Hillis was running the development office. And I benefited from the fact that I was the first. So it meant that it's not that they didn't know what they were looking for and that I didn't know what I was doing, but we were able to build it together. And I leaned pretty heavily on CASE, by the way, Council for Advancement and Supportive Education, to get myself educated and up and running. And, I think it's from my time at Madeira where I really loved the work that I was doing in support of women and girls, particularly, girls' education. And in the rest of my entire professional journey, I think I've always been trying to get back to a girls' school. So that is part of the reason why I'm at Miss Porter's now. But having learned so much about major gift fundraising because I had a lot of flexibility, great mentors, incredible professional development, which I had to seek, by the way. It wasn't just hand delivered to me. And I think this is, again, coming back to liberal education. I got a problem to solve. I need to ask some questions. I need to
Right.
see what's out there. I need to talk to some people who can inform me.
So you spent 7 years at Wesleyan, formative experience education. You spent over 7 years as a fundraiser there. What did you learn about Wesleyan that you didn't know as a student that you better appreciated as a fundraiser?
Yeah. And I think that's also an important aspect when you work for your alma mater, right? You always have some love. You're ever true to the place. You've had a good experience, but then like the scales are kind of removed from your eyes when you're an employee. And you better be prepared for that. You better be prepared for that. You really do see how the sausage is made, and sometimes you don't like it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that my time at Wesleyan, I was a grown up and I knew that, things had to be different. We were having a presidential transition. Wesleyan had not really had a mature development operation. So being there at a time where that was being built was huge. I would say I made a lot of mistakes. I had a lot of grace to go along with that. Um, but I also was able to harness all of the things that I had learned in my time in admissions, my time in graduate school to think about how an institution really needs to run. And we made great strides there. The other thing that I think I learned is that it can take a long time for things to happen. Um, and I'll just share a little bit of an anecdote. When I was the, director of major gifts, one of my projects at that point in 2006 was this wonderfully conceived idea that Wesleyan was going to build a new science center. It was a huge project. It was a lot of money. We just had a new president come on. I was in charge of building an advisory council, bringing all of the great minds together to help us think about the project, but then to really raise money. Then 2008 came along, and guess what? Everything ground to a halt, right? And so we sort of shelved that. Fast forward a few years, a few decades, I'm happy to be on the board of trustees at Wesleyan, where we had the opportunity to finally vote yes on the project, right? And so again, that timing and patience and uh, you know, knowing that things don't happen overnight. And I know that conceptually, but to really be a part of something from start to finish. And then just today, my development officer at Wesleyan calls and says, "Hey, we're getting the band back together. All those people in 2006 who were there at the beginning, we're going to get ready to open this new center, and we're going to do something by Zoom, and then we're going to have a big gathering a little bit later on in the fall." So, you got to play the long game. You got to play the long game, especially in places that you care about. There are all kinds of things that don't move institutions forward at the rate in which you might like for them to move along. But
How,
be
how many,
patient.
how many people in the history of this industry have gotten to see the university through the lens of student, staff, and trustee? Not too many.
Yeah, I have no idea, but boy, has it been, it's that roller coaster ride again,
That,
Brent.
that explains it.
It's exactly. But
So let's make sure to save some time here. Talk about Miss Porter's, and you and I reconnected in Boston recently at a conference, and you were just on the cusp of a big trip to Asia, which not everybody listening might be able to reconcile. But tell me about just independent school, boarding school fundraising, the global nature that you were mentioning, and yeah, I mean, I hope it was a good trip.
yeah, yeah. So, it's interesting. All of our institutions are global in nature, right? And at this moment in time, everybody is taking account of that. Things that maybe we've taken for granted, we're now having to examine a little bit more closely. Miss Porter's school is 183, 84 years old. And we, for a very, very, very long time, have been lucky to attract students from across the globe here. We the trip that you're talking about was a trip that I actually did not go on, but I did a lot of supporting of that trip. I sent our head of school, who had not had an opportunity to be there since the pandemic. Things are so dramatically different. So what that means is that she was going to visit not only students and graduates from that part of the planet, but a significant number of American-born folks who are expats living in that part of the world now. And so that is, I think, a surprising and wonderful aspect of how people are mobile in our society, how people move to different kinds of places. And again, their perspectives are informed. We're proud to call those people our ancients, which is what we call our graduates. But we can learn a lot from them and the ways that they are experiencing the modern world. So, it's fun to be able to go to those places, but it makes us better as an institution when we are, again, um, learning from people. No, we're not just teaching, we're learning as well.
And so as you think about where things go from here, what are you excited about? What are you nervous about? I know you've got your view through your leadership role at Miss Porter's. You shared the Wesleyan trustee perspective, and I know you're just well connected and engaged through CASE and other industry peers as well. So what's top of mind as you think about 25 and beyond?
Yeah, I think a lot about the cost of private education in particular. And, philanthropy helps to underwrite some of that, but it can't fully bridge the difference. I don't care what institution you are. Philanthropy plays an essential part. And I really worry as there's continued erosion of trust in institutions that that will impact the ways in which some of our donors think about our institutions. We have to prove over and over again the value of education, particularly independent education. We should do that joyfully, and we should do that factually. And so I think really being clear about our messaging, our storytelling, and providing evidence of what is going on in our institutions is going to be essential. We need to get better at that.
Yeah, no,
Um,
I agree because I mean, I'm sure like you shared your own personal story and I've shared mine and you hear the stories of donors all the time, right? Who had the same situation you and I did, which is student loan debt and
yeah,
pressures and taking the job and doing the thing and like, but in the grand scheme of things, like one of the most important decisions we've ever made to pursue higher education. And you hear these life-changing stories all the time, and that's just not what's in the news.
right,
And so it's like
right.
there's no shortage of story. Like we hear
Yeah,
the stories constantly. It's how do we at least balance out the narrative so that yes, there are issues and also incredible life-changing generational transformation experiences for thousands and thousands of people all the time. And like that's the piece where it's just, I don't know. I don't know how to fix it. But I know the stories are there.
yeah, and we have to do it together. We have to do it together. I think that every institution wants to tell their own story, but we need to talk directly about the fact that educational institutions do change the world because of the people who come through our doors. And, I just was at a little conference this morning, and my counterparts from two other girls' schools were here, and we just sat in a corner and we're like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could do this program together? And we're going to do it because it's important to tell the story. Again, it's important to show the evidence for us, and we're going to be stronger together than we would be individually. Right. And so, I do think that a rising tide lifts all boats. Certainly, as institutions, we compete. Sometimes we compete for donors, we compete for students. But ultimately, when we talk about what is good for civil society, what is good for our nation, what is good for our planet, we need to be emphasizing those stories. And they're more than just stories, they are proof points. They are proof points of what it means to invest in human potential. And that's why I get out of bed every day to do the work. Kids are amazing and they're all different and they all need something, but their experience at a place like this, at places like the places where your listeners are working, It is essential. It is essential. We have to do the work. We have to tell the stories, and we cannot give up.
I think those are beautiful closing thoughts, Christine. And I've always been motivated and inspired by our conversations, and today is no exception. So thank you so much for taking time. I know you're engaged on LinkedIn, active there. If folks want to reach out, I assume it's okay for them to do so. Mention
Absolutely.
Christine on the Raise podcast, and then are you hiring? Do you expect to be hiring? Opportunity to maybe plug what's going on at Miss Porter's.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, we just hired two new fantastic team members. One started about 2 weeks ago, and another one started on Tuesday.
Wow.
This is also something that I think is very different about philanthropy now is people move a lot. And I think we need to get comfortable with that. And I think that's okay. So anytime we're hiring, you will see a post on my LinkedIn. You'll see posts on our website. And maybe I'll meet you at a conference and we'll have a conversation. The other thing that I tell people is I might not be hiring, but I certainly know a lot of other people who are. So use the network. Use the network. Be in touch.
Well said. Well said. All right,
So
everybody, use the network. You have no excuse.
thanks.
Heard it from Christine. And with that, I'm going to wrap today's episode. Christine, thank you so much. Closing it out with Christine Pena, Chief Advancement Officer at Miss Porter's School. Thanks, Christine, and take care, everybody.
Brent, my absolute pleasure. Take care of your community, everyone. Be well.
Roller coaster.